Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Buckets. If you're over on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and give us a like. We're trying to hit 200k subs by the end of the year. Probably ain't gonna happen, but if you subscribed, it would definitely increase the odds. And go ahead and check us out over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience. So in today's video, I decided I wanted to do a tier list. We've done some tier lists over on the shoot around, but there are a couple of topics that we're probably never really going to do over there just because there's other things to discuss. We've been ranking the best players at each position in the NBA in the previous ones that we've been doing. So if you want to check those out, there's also going to be one this upcoming Wednesday ranking power forwards. But with that all in mind, I wanted to start off this tier list, and we'll see if we do more based on how this video does, on the greatest NBA duos of all time. I put a lot of them in here. Like there's like 70 plus duos in here, and I want to emphasize a point up towards the top. Two-star players is pretty much always gonna be effective and good. So we are comparing the viability of those two stars versus what another pair of two stars is capable of doing. Hopefully that makes sense. With that said, let's hop into it. So first things first, we have Kawhi Leonard and LaMarcus Aldridge. Now, this is a duo that I think is pretty underrated, and it's because of the season that they played in. Kawhi Leonard and LaMarcus Aldridge were a part of the 2015-16 Spurs, which were a team that won 67 games. 67. It's not brought up a lot that the 73-win Warriors and the 67-win Spurs happened in the same season. Anytime you're flirting with 70 wins, you're doing pretty fucking great. So that said, they never ended up winning a championship. I don't believe they made a conference finals, and there's a lot of speculation that they could have done more had they not had Kawhi not sustained that injury from Zaza. But with that in mind, I am going to put LaMarcus Aldridge and Kawhi in the do I go B or C? I am going to put them down here in the C tier. They're about as good as you get without actually being a championship level duo. Then we have Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. I don't really think this is a great duo, both all-star caliber guys. However, they're small guards who aren't good defensively, and I feel like that equation does not work all that often. Reminds me of Dame and CJ in that way. So I'm going to put them in the E tier. They're not an outright bad duo, but I do not think they are anywhere in the upper echelon of all-time greats. LeBron and Dwayne Wade, we can easily go ahead and put into the S tier. It's them. It's just them. They are one of the greatest duos of all time. There's no denying that, and for that reason, I have to put them in the S. John Stockton and Karl Malone. Stockton and Malone, they played 20 years together, made the finals twice in the late 90s, had a lot of playoff disappointments otherwise for many, many years. John Stockton actually had a less prominent role on the Jazz when they made the finals than earlier on in his career. If you look at his assists per game average, he's under double digits for basically the first time in a very long time. And that's because I think the way that this duo approached the game was just fundamentally, dramatically flawed. Not in a way that like couldn't win you a good amount of regular season games and couldn't win you a playoff series or two here or there, but when you actually came to the tough moments, the moments where you needed your duo to prove that they're one of the best, they didn't do it. They just simply didn't do it, and Stockton and Malone are the top two players of all time in games played without a championship. And it's not as though they didn't have as much opportunity, like a comical amount of opportunity. They played together for nearly 20 years. Both of them missed under like 50 games in their careers. So they had each other all the time and consistently fell short. I am going to put them in the C tier because ultimately they won a lot of games and scored a lot of points together, got a lot of numbers, and I can't knock them into a below that tier, but they did not win a championship together. There are probably a couple of teams that I will actually put in the B tier, even though they didn't win a championship together, because they were really good otherwise, but Stockton and Malone are not in that category. Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain are, I think, a duo that can be a little overrated just based on, like, for some reason, almost all the footage of Wilt Chamberlain is him in a Lakers jersey. I say for some reason. It was later on in history, towards the end of his career, when games were recorded more and more, and it's the Lakers, so, you know, that kind of favoritism has pretty much always been in the sport. But he wasn't actually nearly as good as he had been at other points in his career. He did end up 4th in MVP voting in 1969, I think it was, but he did not win the championship that year. They lost even though they were heavily favorited. Elgin Baylor retires, then they get Gail Goodrich, and the duo makes a little bit more sense. Gail is a perfect off guard. Wilt essentially becomes more of a defensive rebounding guy. Jerry West was one of the best players of his era, like truly, like probably the next best guy after Bill and Wilt. They won a championship together in 1972 with a team that I think won 29 straight games and set the NBA record for wins with 69, I think. I'm putting them in B tier because Wilt wasn't as good. They only won one championship, and they probably could have won more. So they ultimately ended up being a tad disappointing. James Harden and Chris... This is James Harden and Russell Westbrook. I forgot to correct this because I did this last time, but whatever. This is Harden and Russ. I'm going to put them in the D tier. Super talented, racked up a crazy amount of numbers together. However, the fact that they had to do that PJ Tucker trade where they put him at center, well, I guess it was the Clint Capella trade to move PJ to center, get Robert Covington at the 4. It was interesting, but it was also clearly not going to work. The fact that you had to make an accommodation like that was so fundamentally broken means the duo was pretty much fundamentally broken. Hakeem Olajuwon and Ralph Sampson, the duo that never really got the chance to be as good as they could have been because unfortunately Ralph Sampson's career was cut short by injury. He was not as good as Hakeem, but he was putting up pretty similar numbers. 2 20 and 10 big men who were great shot blockers and defenders. Made it a bitch to score in the paint, made it a bitch to get any kind of offensive rebounds or even defensive rebounds. Yeah, Hakeem's one of the greatest defenders of all time, and they went to the finals and lost to the Celtics. I think the mid-late 80s, somewhere in that ballpark. Ironically, the Rockets before then made the final. It would have had to have been the late 80s because Hakeem was drafted in 84. They made a final series. They played the Celtics, so they weren't going to win. Larry Bird's Celtics, that is. I think I will put them in the C tier. They could have very easily been A, maybe even S tier if they got a chance to play together even more. DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. This is going to be the first F duo. I think they actively made each other worse players, and their team was not good. A big thing for me as it relates to how much I value these duos, it is very much predicated on how they make each other better players, and if I think that they have a positive play style. And for Trae and Murray, I just simply do not believe that. Steph and Draymond Green. My controversial take about the Warriors is that Draymond Green was a better and more important player than Klay Thompson. I'm not going to argue that point right now, but I decided to do one with Steph and Klay as well. But I'm going to put Steph and Draymond in the A tier because Draymond, not like superstar level. Almost all the teams that are in S are going to be 2 superstar level players. But I think as Steph was the Warriors offense, Draymond was the Warriors defense. And both of them were revolutionary. But regularly, Steph is only given that credit, and I think Draymond deserves more credit. I realize he's doing everything in his power to destroy his reputation the last couple of years, but at his absolute peak, he was arguably the best defender in the NBA, really good playmaker, and his 3-ball was not as disastrous as it would be later on in his career. De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. These guys pulled off the miracle that was getting the Sacramento Kings to the NBA playoffs for the first time in wasn't quite 20 seasons, but it was approaching that territory, which is saying a lot. They're very good offensively, and they have good synergy, and they make each other better, but there is a problem in that their defense is pretty bad, and I don't think that they'll ever reach a contender level with this duo because of that reason. So this is more of like a duo that gets you middle of the pack standing in the conference and like maybe a playoff spot, but that's about as far as it will go. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in D, kind of similar to Harden and Russ, in that they'll put up good numbers and they will make the playoffs, but it just doesn't feel like there's much chance that it's going to go any further than that. Bill Russell and Bob Cousy. These two won a bunch of championships together. Obviously, Bill is the better player, and I think Cousy is I don't know if he's overrated. He's probably underrated as a whole, but there are some old heads who will act like the guy is on Steph's level every once in a while. I'm looking at that fucking Mad Dog guy or whatever the hell his name is. They won too many championships together not to rank them highly. However, factoring in that the 60s were a weaker era, and factoring in that I think Cousy was just not a type of player who could translate across eras and just not that great to begin with, I am going to put them in the A tier. They won too many championships together not to be in that, but I don't think Cousy was that great. Chris Paul and Blake Griffin. Man, this duo was fun. This is easily the most... Well, I don't know if it's easily the most fun duo, but it's one of the most fun duos who have ever graced this sport. The perfect chemistry between the two of them. Pick and roll, perfect pick and roll. Ball handler, perfect pick and roll man. Blake Griffin also had more offensive versatility than history tends to remember, just because he was mostly known as the guy who dunks a lot. Chris Paul is one of the greatest point guards of all time. I personally think he's the third best, and maybe not greatest, but third best point guard who's ever played the game. Also one of the most well-rounded players who's ever played the game. That said, they didn't end up winning in the playoffs, didn't even make it conference finals. However, that said, if you look at the record and you look year by year, basically every one of those seasons, either Chris Paul got hurt or Blake Griffin got hurt. Or both. There's really only one year where it was just their fault. It was just simply their fault that they lost, and that was when they blew the lead to the Houston Rockets that they should have won, and Josh Smith and Corey Brewer just came out of nowhere and buried them with a bunch of three-pointers. To be fair to them, not something you exactly game plan for because, well, those players aren't very good at shooting. Still let it happen, and it was... I think a lot of people treat that game like that is what they were like all the time in the playoffs. The reality is they were very good in the regular season and could have had more dominance if they weren't extremely unhealthy. That said, I'm not going to put them in the B tier as a non-championship duo, though I was on the fence about it. I did consider it. Tim Duncan and David Robinson. So this is a duo that can be a little overrated just based on the fact that David Robinson really was not David Robinson for more than just 1 year. 1999, he was not quite at his peak, but pretty much in the vicinity of it. He was like 30, in his early 30s at that point. But their championship in 2003, Robinson was scoring less than 10 points, getting less than like 8 rebounds a game. He was a bona fide role player at that point in his career, and Tim Duncan just did a carry job all the way for that title. So sometimes I feel like Robinson can get some more credit for that than is actually correct, but also a young Tim Duncan is one of the best primes of all time, one of the best players of all time. I'm going to put them in A because David Robinson wasn't superstar level at this point in his career. If it was both of them in their primes, easily an S tier duo. It's not even close. Here we have the actual Harden and Chris Paul duo. So these two are going to be our first non-championship B-tier duo because I believe these two led one of the at least 3 best non-championship teams in NBA history. The 2017-18 Houston Rockets won 60-plus games, I believe. They were really good in the playoffs, and they pushed the Warriors with Kevin Durant to 7 games. Realistically, they probably win that series if Chris Paul does not tear his hamstring, and those Warriors had no business losing to anybody, so it shows quite a bit how good Harden and Chris Paul were together. Unlike with Russell Westbrook, Chris Paul was a floor spacer, and they had a better overall chemistry, and they didn't have to go get a fucking power forward to play center in order to make the team make some sense. So I'm going to put them in the B tier, one of the best non-championship duos that have ever played. Zion and Brandon Ingram was a duo that I thought made a lot more sense than it has made lately. Unfortunately, Brandon Ingram, while capable of shooting threes, does not shoot them at a high enough volume, doesn't really seem as confident in them as he really should, and he's more predicated to taking a bunch of mid-range pull-ups. He's not bad at those shots, but it's not really the type of player that Zion needs. You really don't need another inside the three-point line scorer. You're going to need another guy to be a high volume three-point shooter. That's the most ideal secondary to Zion, and that's not what Brandon Ingram is. They're not bad, but I do think there are a lot of flaws in the construction of that duo, so I'm going to put them in the E tier. They've also been disappointing, but that's largely due to injuries. We haven't really been able to see them all that much. Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter led the Portland Trail Blazers to the 1992 NBA Finals to lose to Michael Jordan's Bulls, and I think it was 5 or 6 games. Clyde Drexler was the best shooting guard of the era after Michael Jordan. There was a huge steep drop-off into that territory, but nevertheless, Terry Porter wasn't a superstar tier player, unlike Clyde Drexler. So this is another superstar and then good second option. I'm actually not too familiar with what exactly Terry Porter averaged. I would guess like 18 and 7 in that ballpark. 1992, when they made the finals, they averaged 18 points, and he averaged 18 points and 6 assists. Also shot 40% from 3 on 4 attempts a game at this time is pretty high volume. So really, really good shooter, good playmaker, and yeah, good point guard overall. Made 2 all-star teams. I think we will put them in the C tier. Not quite B tier level. Not quite that good for not being a championship duo. Greg Monroe and Andre Drummond, we can go ahead and put this duo in the F. Oh my God, what a nightmare that duo was. Just absolutely terrible that the franchise chose to build around those guys, like completely ludicrous. All right, Kawhi and Paul George. This is a fucking controversial one. These guys should have been more successful. There's no doubt about that, but I do think that it's worth mentioning that they have not had a lot of time to actually play together, and at least in the regular season when they've played together, they have been dominant. Their regular season win percentage together is like in the 70s, I think, which is extremely good. Unfortunately, they're about 500 in the playoffs. Part of it, again, injury stuff. Sometimes they played together, but there was some lingering stuff, and Kawhi actually wasn't all that good. But they've had a lot of years together, a lot of opportunity. I think an issue with them as a duo that just simply is not mentioned enough is that neither of them are high-level playmakers. If you take a look at some of the best duos of all time, and you can go ahead and take a look after this list is complete, you're going to see mostly at least one player on that team who's a very strong passer. Paul George and Kawhi are fine as playmakers. They're not exceptional at it. They're not bad at it. They check the box well enough, but it's not like a very confident check. And the fact that they're both wing players who like to do isolations. Paul George is more of an off-ball player because of his three-point shooting, which is definitely superior to Kawhi's. But either way, they just don't make each other better to the same degree that their talent would suggest. Like, they're an extremely talented duo, but they do not elevate each other's talent to the point where they're actually as threatening as they otherwise should be. So I am going to put them into the C tier. Yet again, lots of C tier duos at this point because I do think they're good. I don't want to disparage them with that, but yeah, sucks. Dame and CJ. The fact that this duo made a conference finals kind of makes me want to put them in the C tier just because they overachieved. But otherwise, this wasn't a great duo. CJ wasn't even an all-star level player, or at least never made an all-star team. As it relates to synergy, as it relates to making each other better players, I really don't think they did that too much. They both spaced the floor extremely well. This is one of the better three-point shooting duos in NBA history. The defense was a huge problem that was never going to be overcame, and the fact that they spent years and years and years with this duo knowing that kind of feels like a waste. And a waste of both of their times. CJ could have been more effective as a secondary to a to a defensive player, Dame could have been more effective with his secondary and the rest of his team at large being more defensive oriented. Unfortunately, neither of them got that, and most of their primes were wasted on each other. So I'm going to put them in the D tier. Not happy about it. They're probably going to be one of the better duos in the D tier, and they spent a lot of time together, but not going to give them that. Kareem and Oscar. So Oscar Robertson, not at a prime of his career. Let me actually look up the numbers. 1971, when they won the championship, he did end up 5th in MVP voting, which is curious. MVP voting back then was player voted, I believe, so I actually don't know how valid that really ends up being. But 19 points a game, 8 assists per game, 5.7 rebounds, 50% from the field, 85% from the free throw line. Really, really good free throw shooter. Excellent mid-range shooter, good slasher, but he wasn't putting up, like, if you look at his stretch from 63 to 68, he is putting up 30 points, 11 assists, 8 rebounds, shooting 50% from the field, 86% from the free throw line on 11 attempts per game. Not quite the same player in Milwaukee. So, Kareem, on the other hand, is the best fucking player in the world at this stage of the NBA. He is easily the best player in the world. So I have to put them in A tier for that. They also didn't spend a lot of time together, and I think you could argue there's a good chance they should have won more than just one championship together. Oscar's numbers started to drop off after 72, so the fact that they didn't get it in 72 probably hurt them quite a bit. They did end up making the conference finals, but they lost to the Lakers in the Western Conference because, yes, it was the Western Conference in 1972 the Bucks were in. I'm putting them in A. If they were both at their peak, this is another, like, easy S, but they were not at their peaks. Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan. A lot of games together, a lot of opportunity, but also not that much opportunity because they played in the Eastern Conference with LeBron James. I think these guys made each other better for sure. I think DeMar's isolation scoring made up for the fact that Lowry is not always the most aggressive in terms of looking for his own shot. Lowry had a three-point ability that made up for the fact that DeMar definitely did not. One of the better pull-up three-point shooters in the NBA for his time. Pretty solid defender as well, despite not being a very big guy. Good playmaker. DeMar was a solid playmaker, but neither of them were great defenders. And I feel like the offense was never, like, truly excellent. Let me actually just confirm that real quick. Like, I think it was top 10 fairly regularly. If we go to 2014-15, they were 4th in offensive rating, 5th in offensive rating, 6th in offensive rating, 2nd in offensive rating. All right, the offense was better than I gave it credit for. In that case, I think these guys, I'm almost tempted to put them in B, but the fact of the matter is neither of them were superstar tier players at any point in their career, and I think that factor holds them in the C tier. I'm kind of giving some credit to unsuccessful duos for at least being good in the regular season for a long stretch of time and playing together for a long stretch of time. Definitely a little disappointing. Tim Duncan and Tony Parker. Obviously, you could argue Manu should be here instead, but just given the fact that Tony was the starter and Manu wasn't, Tony ended up playing more minutes. 2007 Finals MVP, you could argue that Manu should have won the 2005 Finals MVP, but with that in mind, Tony was probably the better player holistically throughout Tim Duncan's career, but I actually think Manu peaked a little bit higher than Tony Parker and probably could have been better if utilized differently. But that in mind, these guys won, I believe it was either 3 or 4. I think it was 4 because I think Parker was on the 03 team. He just wasn't very good at that stage. But 2005, 2007, and 2014, they won those titles together as well. And Tony Parker had a phenomenal 2007 Finals. Let me pull up the stats here. There was just nothing the fucking the Cavs could do to stop him. He only averaged 3.3 assists, which is not a lot for a point guard, but he averaged an extremely efficient 24.5 points per game. He shot 57% from the field and 57% from 3. This was also almost entirely pure buckets. He hit 10 free throws, made 42 field goals, What is his true shooting percentage? It's at 60% because he actually shot a little poorly from the free throw line. But yeah, if you watch the highlights from that series, it's like, man, nobody can stay in front of him. He's so fast, and as long as you give him just an inch of daylight for the floater, it's over. And Tim Duncan is obviously Tim Duncan, so I'm going to put these guys in the A tier, winning 4 titles together, even if Parker was less significantly a part of that, and in the 2003 series and the 2014 one being more of a collective, holistic effort. Still very, very good, winning some at their peaks. Willis Reed and Walt Frazier. These guys won the only 2 championships in New York Knicks history in 1970 and 1974. Willis Reed had the famous game where he got hurt. I don't remember the exact details of it, but he got hurt and he ended up playing in the game anyways through like a severe injury. He only scored a couple of points, but it really inspired his team, and they ended up winning a series where it looked like they were going to end up losing it because of his injury. Walt Frazier was a very good defensive guard and an overall good playmaker and scorer. Like, I don't think that there was that much unique about his offensive game. I do feel like he was probably a little tall for the point guard position. Yeah, he's 6'4". It's not that tall now, but in 1970, only being 2 inches shorter than the average height, it's pretty short, or pretty tall rather, for the point guard position. But if you look at his stats from 70 to 74, he's putting up 21 points a game, 6 assists, almost 7 rebounds. So he's also a really good rebounder. 2 steals, nearly 50% from the field, made 7 all defensive teams. Willis Reed, a good scorer, and also, to give him credit, a scorer in a way that wasn't all that conventional for his time. He was a power forward who was primarily a mid-range shot creator. That is not typical. That is not the type. He was basically LaMarcus Aldridge in the 1970s. So, because they won 2 championships for the New York Knicks, even though I do feel like the 70s were a weaker era, they're also one of 2 teams to win 2 titles in the era. The Celtics won 2 championships in 74 and 76, but every other year it's a one-off, except for Willis Reed and Walt Frazier's New York Knicks. So I'm going to put them in the A tier, one of the more underrated duos of all time. Bill Walton and Maurice Lucas. Walton is the more known player between the two, but Lucas was also a 20-10 big man, actually more of a scorer than Walton, while Walton was more of a playmaker and defensive presence. They played off of each other well, one of the best big man duos of all time, and they won a championship together in 1977. So I'm going to put them in the B tier. The fact it's a one-off title and they didn't play together that long because of Walton injury stuff knocks them down a little bit. And again, I feel like the 70s were probably the worst era of the NBA. So other than the 50s, since that technically qualifies, and the 40s. But yeah, 60s and onward, the 70s were the worst 10-year stretch. Curry and Klay, I mentioned earlier that I was going to put them in here. I'm actually going to put them in the B tier rather than the A tier, which I know will sound blasphemous to people, but I do think this is a matter of where I put Draymond over it. It's just because they make up for each other's weaknesses more than Klay and Steph do for each other's. That's not to say they don't, because they absolutely do. Klay was a really good perimeter defender at his peak, and the fact that you had to deal with both of these guys on the floor as shooters at the same time opened up opportunities for both of them very frequently. And because of that, three-point shooting was even easier for them than it otherwise would have been if they played on other teams. If you were to try and make an argument against Steph as a three-point shooter, the only argument that could truly exist would be that, like, Klay being on the floor helped because there was another guy that the defense had to panic about potentially leaving open. I'm actually going to put them in A tier now that I think about it. I do think Draymond and Steph is better, but I also feel like they're better than the B tier duos. They did ultimately win 4 championships together, with Klay being an integral part of 3 of them. All right, this one's going to be controversial as well. Kareem and Magic are often listed by a lot of people as one of the top 5, top 3, even number 1 duos of all time. However, I will argue against that point because I don't believe that either of them really were at their peak at the same time. Their peaks did not really overlap. Rather, Kareem was the guy at the start of Magic's career, and then he started to decline as he got older because he was already in his 30s by the time he was playing with Magic. And then Magic made up for the fact that Kareem had slipped a little bit due to older age by him finally breaking out to true superstar level and starting to win MVPs himself. Now, the reason that Magic wasn't really at his peak earlier on in his career was not really because he was incapable of putting up the numbers he would later in his career, but rather that he was just not afforded the same opportunity. He played shooting guard for the first 4 seasons of his career alongside Norm Nixon, and he had to use his passing ability just far less. He was not as prominent of an orchestrator of the offense. He did lead the league as a shooting guard in 1983 with 10.5 per game, but that would not compare to his peak numbers, where after that, from 83 to 91, he averaged 20 points and 12.5 assists per game. Before that, he's at like, what is it? Let me add up these first 4 years of his career. He ends up being at 9 assists per game. Definitely not as prominent as his later numbers. His points are also lower. His steals are a little bit higher, and his efficiency is marginally better. But he wasn't at his peak. And then Kareem, we're saying 73 or 83, 84 is when Magic is like really breaking into upper echelon of players. By that point, Hakeem is averaging 21 points and 7 rebounds. And for the entire stretch from Kareem, from the entire stretch from 83 to 89, he averaged 18 points and 6 rebounds per game. Now, obviously, sharing the floor with Magic Johnson and having as much talent as was on that Lakers roster, he's not going to put up as large of numbers as he was at earlier stages of his career, but there is also no doubt that the guy had declined. He was not nearly as good as he was at his peak, and again, Magic was not nearly as good as Kareem was earlier on when they won the championship in 1980 and 1982. I'm going to put them in A tier. They still won 5 championships together. That's something to write home about for sure. Because they didn't peak together, I am going to put them in the A tier. This is, again, another duo where I'm like, if they're at their peak, there isn't a fucking conversation. It's S tier, no doubt. But there really wasn't an overlap. Maybe a year or 2 in there where they were overlapping, but not a long stretch. Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. This is in the hall of what the hell went wrong. These guys were excellent offensively, as you well expect, and the team managed to be decent defensively, even in spite of the fact that neither of them were super strong defenders. Kevin Durant's versatility ends up always being an impactful thing. But what gets to me about this duo is that they kept going and then they made it a trio. I think very much so that if these two just stuck together and they didn't blow up the roster otherwise, they kept Jarrett Allen, they kept Karis LeVert, they didn't fucking sign DeAndre Jordan and waste that roster spot on him, making them undervalue Jarrett Allen, so they eventually move on from him to get James Harden, moving all those first round picks as well, because they also could have cashed those first round picks in for other role players. Like, if the Nets just took their approach differently, and a lot of that, most reports suggest that Durant and Kyrie were pressuring the Nets front office to make a lot of these decisions, including firing head coach Kenny Atkinson in favor of their lackey Steve Nash. All of that said, this was a disaster that should have been really good. The fact that they went to 7 games against the team that won the championship, despite the fact that Kyrie Irving got hurt in game 4, I was actually at that game, says a lot. They could have won a championship together, but they didn't, and it's because of a lot of their own bullshit, but it's not because of their basketball ability, so it's kind of hard to quantify because there's a lot of factors in this. So with that said, I am going to put them in C. Again, I think I'm going to put them in B because their talent is just so undeniable, and it should have worked, and I think it mostly would have worked, 9 times out of 10. Next, Kyrie Irving and LeBron James. Great synergy as a duo. This is the way that LeBron and Wade worked, except Kyrie was a very good three-point shooter, and that really knocked out the only real kink that existed with LeBron and Wade. I do feel like Cavs LeBron was just a step below Heat LeBron, and that Dwayne Wade defensively is a considerably better player than Kyrie on that end of the floor. I also feel like he's a marginally better playmaker. I think they're S tier, though. I feel like they could have won more together. They probably would have won multiple championships together if not for Kevin Durant signing with the Warriors. So I'm going to put them in this S tier echelon. I think they are one of the best to ever do it. You get a good scoring guard next to LeBron James, and then shit gets real. Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler. The story of this duo is that they traded for Drexler in 1995, moving, I think, Otis Thorpe in the process, who was a big part of their championship team the year prior. This was controversial, both from the fan base and within the franchise itself. A lot of people on the Rockets didn't end up liking Clyde Drexler initially because they felt like he was kind of cramping their style, but they ended up winning a championship anyways as the 5th seed, the lowest seeded NBA champion of all time. And they worked perfectly together because Hakeem does his big man stuff really well and Drexler did his perimeter scoring stuff really well. In 1994, Hakeem was just surrounded by mostly shooters and guys who were competent scorers, but not great ones like Robert Horry and Kenny Smith. And Clyde added a dynamic to their offense that they never had before, which was just a high volume, good floor spacing, and effective shot creator. I want to put them in A because they didn't win more than one, and Drexler kind of declined very soon after this. Hakeem declined a little considerably as well, but I think Drexler was the first one to really fall off. He retired before Hakeem did. Okay, I'm going to put him in S, and here's why. This is entirely based on my own theory, so whatever, it's my fucking list. Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls are fucking lucky they didn't have to face this team, because I will argue that the biggest weakness, the Achilles heel that existed for the Chicago Bulls that they managed to avoid for the most part was a big man and guard duo, an effective one where the big man was truly fucking dominant. The best that they ever succeeded in beating was the Orlando Magic with Shaq and Penny. But they also lost to the Orlando Magic with Shaq and Penny. Blame that on rust if you want, but Michael Jordan was still putting up pretty good numbers by the end of the season, and they were looking more like the Bulls of old going into it. I understand the excuse for that, but I do think you get Hakeem, who defensively the rim is on lock now. Makes it much harder for Michael to get to the basket, for Scottie to get to the basket, for Dennis Rodman to dominate on the boards, if they even would have had him by 1995, and Clyde Drexler as that scoring option that the defense also has to focus on. The Bulls would get through big men, and they had times where they beat big men along the way. They never really had a super high value shot creator. It was Penny and Shaq was the only real one. They were really young in their development, so they really weren't at their best. And the New York Knicks, because John Starks was an all-star like once or twice, but he did not demand the attention to the extent that Drexler did. He was not nearly as good as Drexler was. I'm going to put them in S because truly, just from a fit standpoint, I don't think it gets any better than this. And I think that they would have been the team to beat the Chicago Bulls if Michael Jordan had not retired in the middle of his career. Another Houston Rockets duo here, James Harden and Dwight Howard. Not nearly as good of a duo as Hakeem and Drexler. They won a good amount of regular season games together, and I feel like Dwight Howard's Rockets era can be a little bit underrated because people treat it like he just outright fell off the moment he left the Magic, but he was still an all-star, I believe, with Houston a few times. Still a double-double efficient big man, still a very devastating rim protector. But I know that they hated each other, and Dwight Howard didn't really like running pick and roll, despite the fact that James Harden's one of the best pick and roll players of all time. So D tier for them, another D tier James Harden duo. That's tough. This one I decided to put in because it was cute, because like for 2 years, Wade and Bosh played together without LeBron. They were, I believe, a playoff team once or twice in there. I think they beat the Charlotte Hornets in a series. Cut short by Chris Bosh having heart issues, Dwayne Wade going to a different franchise on the Chicago Bulls. However, I think they were really good, and they could have been truly like, I think they were good enough that they, given how well they fit, that they could have actually been a contending level team if there was a better core around them. Didn't happen though, so I'm going to put them in D, unfortunately. D for D Wade. Roy Hibbert and Paul George. This is the only team that ever truly challenged the Heatles. And that is a factor, well, the Heatles at their best, I should say, which was 2012 and 2013. In those 2 years, this was the only team that actually made them sweat for real. Like, actually be truly afraid that they were going to lose the series. Also, the Spurs, too. But in the Eastern Conference, at least, this was the only team. They fucking destroyed the Chicago Bulls in 2011. That was before they were even in their peak. I do think these two deserve some credit. Roy Hibbert was one of the best rim protectors in the NBA, and Paul George was a budding superstar. I don't know if he was quite in that territory. They didn't play together that long, so I'm going to put them in the D tier, but I do think they were good enough to be worthy of mention. All right, Kobe and Shaq, S tier. We don't need to waste any time on this. I think they're the greatest duo of all time. As it relates to like duo synergy, doesn't get better than this. Superstar guard, superstar center. I think a big man guard duo is the best form of duo, the best structure to have with a duo. So yeah, I'm going Kobe and Shaq, S tier, no hesitation. Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler made 2 finals together when no one really anticipated it. Their defense together is ridiculous. They have some serious half-court offense limitations, though. Both of them really like their mid-range jumpers, despite the fact that they're not, like, mega efficient on them. They made 2 finals, though. And that ain't nothing for sure. And they haven't exactly had the best teams around them doing it. When you look at the talent after them, it gets pretty high up there. So I think I have to put them in B tier for that reason. B for Bam. Harden and Embiid. This is finally a James Harden duo that will not be in D tier or in the B tier for Chris Paul. These guys, how do I feel about these guys? Not great. I'll tell you that. I don't feel great about them. But I also do think they're super talented. Superstar player in Embiid. James Harden not quite in that echelon anymore, but one of the best playmakers in the NBA, led the league in assists. But they also both dropped in the playoffs, which basically everybody called. I'm going to put them in C. I'm going to put them in C. I thought about putting them in B because talent-wise, I do think they're up there. But if you don't execute, you don't execute, and it's going to be hard for me to rank you highly when that's the case. LaMarcus Aldridge and Damian Lillard played together for quite a bit of time. I feel like this era of the NBA is not talked about a lot. The Portland Trail Blazers actually could have been a contender tier team if Greg Oden and Brandon Roy didn't sustain his injuries, and there's no reason that they couldn't have gotten Damian Lillard with that core because they got him from a pick that they traded for years prior. I believe they traded Gerald Wallace for the pick that was used to draft Dame. I'm going to put them in C tier. I'm not going to harp on them too much. LaMarcus Aldridge is one of the best scorers in the NBA in his time. Ja and Jaren Jackson Jr., this is another one. Duo really makes sense. Stretch big man, although Jaren's efficiency at that can be a little questionable. Slashing point guard who's really good at getting to the rim, really good playmaker. Jaren's one of the best defensive players in the NBA. I want to put them in C tier because they haven't had a ton of playoff success thus far, but you know, we fast forward a couple of years, I'm pretty confident these guys are going to be up there. Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook. This one wasn't outright terrible, but it definitely wasn't good. So I'm going to put them in E. Giannis and Dame, an extremely disappointing duo, but one that has a lot of potential and upside. I still think that they can be really good, but I feel like I would get in trouble. Y'all would yell at me if I didn't put them in C. Shaquille O'Neal and Dwayne Wade. It is worthy of mention that Shaq really was not Shaq when they won the championship in 2006, but he was second in MVP voting in 2005. Wade had broken out at that point, so he was superstar tier as well, pretty much from his second season. And they won a championship together in 06. Even though Shaq didn't put up great numbers in that series, they still were ultimately a duo, and Shaq was a prominent part of them even getting there. So I'm going to put them in the B tier. I think I'm going to put them in A. Not a ton of time together, but really effective when they were together. Alonzo Mourning and Penny Hardaway, lots of playoff teams in the 90s. One of the best, most prolific Eastern Conference teams, one of the few teams that could even remotely compete with the Chicago Bulls. Big man guard, Mourning a great defender, 20 and 10 guy. Tim Hardaway, one of the best crossovers of all time. I'm going to put them in B. I think they're one of the best non-championship duos. Thus far, we only actually have 2 championship teams in the tier where I said you need to be a champion, but there are some duos that, like the championship, it's just removing context at that point. KG and Pierce won in 2008. Neither of them were quite at their peaks. I think KG was the better player at that time, even though I feel like it's weird that there's not much discussion about that, and from what I can tell, there wasn't much then. It's just interesting when you contrast that to what happens with Tatum and Brown now. But I'm going to put them in the A tier. Only won 1 championship, and I know a lot of people look at it as a trio, but I think KG and Pierce were better players than Ray Allen was at that stage in his career. I'm running out of room to actually show these, but Westbrook and KD, this is going to be another B-tier duo that isn't a champion. Probably would have been if things went differently. Yao and T-Mac is a really disappointing one because it was really the only time in T-Mac's career where he had real help. And since then, or not since then, yeah, he fell off after that. So didn't end up achieving a lot along the way. I want to put him in C tier because they were still pretty good and they could have been a lot better if injuries didn't ruin things. Jerry West and Elgin Baylor made 9 straight, might not have been straight, but they made 9 finals together. It might have been 8 actually, because Baylor retired before the Lakers would finally win a championship, which is pretty sad because he was just outside of the timeline for that. But Jerry West, one of the best players in the NBA, and Elgin Baylor, one of the best players in the NBA, and they won the Western Conference like every fucking year. So I'm going to put them in B. Tatum and Brown, oh man, they're going to be mad at me. I'm going to put them in B just because I don't think... Actually, no, I'm going to put them in A because of their conference finals appearances, like the amount of regular season success that they have had. They don't make each other better to the extent that I prefer, but still a good duo ultimately. Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars. I feel like Joe Dumars is super underrated and Isaiah is pretty regularly overrated because a lot of people treat it like he was like by far and away the best player on the Pistons, when I really don't think that was the case. He was just their best offensive player. Dumars was the best two-way player by far, and great defender, good scorer. I am going to put them in the B tier because while they do qualify as a duo, the Pistons weren't really a duo type team. It was all about their synergy, all about the team as a whole, all about like an egalitarian approach, my favorite word to use. Patrick Ewing and John Starks. John Starks was not really that great. Not really that great of a star tier guard. So I'm going to put them in C. Multiple playoff appearances together though, so can't knock them any lower than that. Al Jefferson and Kemba Walker. I'm going to put them... Do I put them in... I think I'm going to put them in E, actually, because they might not be that great, and the fucking... Not Hornets. What were they called at the time? The Bobcats jerseys are horrible. I hate... The worst jerseys of all time. But they made the playoffs together in Charlotte. All right? They had no business doing that. So the fact that they did that even once, I think, has to keep them above the F tier. Bradley Beal and John Wall, a duo with a lot of upside that didn't really end up coming to be. Beal was more of an off-ball guard at this stage of his career. John Wall, one of the best two-way players in the NBA, one of the best playmakers in the NBA, one of the best slashers in the NBA. Up there in MVP voting in 2017, like I believe top 5 or 6. Got his career-ending injury the year after that, unfortunately. I actually picked him to win MVP that year. I don't even know if they've won 50 games together. If they did, it didn't happen a lot. And they really weren't all that great in the playoffs. Never really made it past, I think they never made it past the second round. So I'm going to put them in E tier. Moses Malone and Julius Erving. I do want to give credit where it's due to the Philadelphia 76ers of 83. It's 83 that they won, right? I'm pretty sure. Might have been 84, but I'm pretty sure it's 83. These guys were so dominant. Malone famously said, "Fo, fo, fo," talking about what was going to happen for them in the playoffs, because I believe they were at the stage where the NBA playoffs allow you to skip the first round if you're one of the higher seeds, which is a weird rule that no one really talks about anymore. But Malone and Julius Erving. Julius stepped his numbers down. Malone won MVP in 83 after winning MVP in 82 for Houston. So he won back-to-back MVPs on different teams. They only lost one game on their way to a championship, and they had Andrew Toney as another guard. I think there's a point guard who I'm blanking on right now. Maybe it's Mo Cheeks, who is a very, very good defensive player. So I'm going to put these guys in the S tier, actually. Another shorter-lived duo, but the fact that they got the only championship of the 1980s that did not go to either the Celtics, Lakers, or Pistons, I think that makes them stand out as fairly unique. Kevin Garnett and Stephon Marbury we're going to put in the D tier. Marbury really broke out later on in his career, unfortunately. Jason Kidd and Al Jefferson, the power of the bald. They made the finals a few times, twice. I don't understand why when I looked up duo list, I would regularly see Kidd and Vince instead of Kidd and Jefferson, even though Vince came there after their finals runs. So I think Jefferson is a more prominent piece of that. Made the finals a couple of times. I feel like Jason Kidd can be overrated by some people, underrated by others. I think I'm going to go... I'm tempted to go D tier. I think I'm going to go C. I'm also going to zoom out a little bit because this is getting fucking crowded. Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, S tier. We don't need to waste time on that. I think they're the second best duo of all time behind Kobe and Shaq. Luka and Kyrie Irving just made a finals together, one of the best duos in the NBA currently. Excellent offense. There's an argument to be made their defense is a limiting factor for them going all the way, but I do think that their offense is so good and Luka is so good and Kyrie is so great as a second option that I have to put them in the B tier. John Havlicek and Dave Cowens. I mentioned earlier the Celtics won 2 championships in the 70s. It was with these two. Dave Cowens, a 20 and 10 big man. John Havlicek, a versatile forward who I believe in the 74 playoffs averaged like 25, 7, and 7. He won finals MVP then. Cowens won it in 76 after Havlicek had gotten a little bit worse. They kind of didn't have their peaks overlap too dramatically. 2 championships in the 70s, only players to do it. I'm going to put him in the B. Put him in B tier. Kobe and Pau Gasol. I'm going to... Man, I think I'm going to put them in S tier. Pau is probably the worst player on this list of all the S tier teams, but he had such a good connection with Kobe, and he was still like a top 15 NBA player. Good defender, excellent, versatile offensive big man. So, and Kobe was one of the best players in the league at that point. So in totality, the fact they won back-to-back championships together, I think I give them that. On top of the fact that the roster beyond them wasn't too special. Not bad, but not too special. Shaq and Penny, they're going in the B tier. One of the best duos that didn't win a championship. Jamal Murray and Jokic are going to go in the A tier. Charles Barkley and Kevin Johnson made the 93 finals. I'm going to put them in the B tier. Kevin Johnson is a player I think is pretty underrated. Durant and Booker. I think these guys are a terrible duo. I don't think they make each other better, and I think it doesn't make any sense that they're together. Bird and McHale. I'm going to put these guys in the A tier. I'm just going to put this over here and slide it over at the end. Steph and KD is S, no doubt about it. Top 3 players in the league on the same team is ridiculous. Nash and Dirk, one of the better offensive duos of the time. Man, there's no fucking space. LeBron and AD, I think I can't. I'm actually going to put them in S because, again, it's just the big man perimeter player thing. If you want to knock them for the past couple of years, you can do that. I really think that's an injury and poor roster management thing and not on them. And I just think defensively, AD was outstanding. Also, dude, 2020 AD was a different breed. He peaked at the right time. Dude shot like 55% from mid-range. He shot like 38% from 3. Like his jump shot was going in and then some, and it really elevated their game. Maybe it was the bubble environment or whatever, but they were just fucking ridiculous. Iverson and Melo, they were much better with Melo and Chauncey Billups because this is just an overlap in skill set. I actually think there is a relatively reasonable comparison between them and Booker and Durant. Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp, I think one of the best non-champion duos of all time, and they're going to be the last one that we rank. I am going to put them in the B tier. I think they're one of the best non-champion duos of all time. Let me make this shit fit. It's gonna look kind of bad, but it will fit, and that's all that matters. So here is the tier list. You can go ahead and look at some of the specifics if you want to, but I feel pretty great about this. LeBron and Wade, Kyrie and LeBron, Hakeem and Drexler, Kobe and Shaq, Moses Malone and Julius Erving, Jordan and Pippen, Kobe and Pau, Steph and KD, and LeBron and AD are your S tier duos. Steph and Draymond, Russell and Kuzi, Duncan and Robinson, Kareem and Oscar, Duncan and Parker, Reed and Frazier, Curry and Clay, Kareem and Magic, Shaq and Wade, KG and Pierce, Tatum and Brown, Jokic and Murray, and Bird and McHale are your A tiers, and then I'm not reading the rest of them. You can look at it. Thanks for watching the video. Shout out to Nick for editing this one because it's quite a long one, but that is it. Goodbye.